September 15th, 1944. Peleliu Island, Palau. The air shimmers with heat that has nothing to do with the tropical sun. A young Marine from Ohio crouches at the mouth of a limestone cave, his back weighed down by twin cylinders that slosh quietly with each breath. The M2 flamethrower strapped to his shoulders holds 4 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel, a mixture that can turn rock into an oven and air into fire. He can hear them inside, shuffling, whispers in Japanese, the metallic click of rifle bolts. His squad leader gives the signal. The Marine steps forward, raises the wand, and squeezes the trigger. What happens next lasts 7 seconds, but those 7 seconds will haunt both sides of this war for the rest of their lives. By the autumn of 1944, the United States had been clawing its way across the Pacific for nearly 3 years. Island by island, atoll by atoll, each piece of coral and volcanic rock purchased with American blood. The strategy was clear: establish air bases close enough to strike the Japanese mainland, choke their supply lines, force a collapse. But the execution was proving nightmarish. The Japanese had learned. After early defeats at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, Imperial commanders abandoned banzai charges and beachfront defenses. Instead, they turned inward, they dug, they fortified, they transformed islands into labyrinths of interconnected caves, tunnels, and bunkers carved deep into rock and coral. Places where artillery couldn't reach, where naval bombardment was useless, where every yard required men to walk into darkness and drag the enemy out by force. Peleliu was supposed to take 4 days. Marine Corps planners estimated light resistance. The island stretched barely 6 miles long, held by roughly 10,000 Japanese defenders under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. Intelligence suggested the usual pattern: a fight on the beaches, a push inland, mop-up operations. But Nakagawa had spent months preparing something different. He abandoned the shoreline. He built 500 fortified positions in the island's central ridges, a hellish landscape called the Umur Bragol Pocket, later nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge. Pillboxes with interlocking fields of fire, caves with multiple entrances and escape routes, spider holes concealed in coral outcroppings, every position designed for maximum killing efficiency while preserving Japanese lives as long as possible. The Americans landed on September 15th under murderous fire. Within hours, the Marine Corps realized this wasn't going to be another quick victory. The battle that was supposed to end in 4 days would drag on for 2 months. Casualty rates spiked to levels not seen since Tarawa. Men advanced 10 yards and lost a dozen Marines doing it. Grenades didn't work. The enemy was too deep. Satchel charges barely scratched the surface. Artillery and air support could pummel ridgelines all day, and the Japanese would simply wait underground, emerging the moment American infantry climbed into view. Commanders faced a terrible equation. Every cave held between 5 and 50 soldiers. The island had hundreds of caves. Digging them out one by one with rifles and grenades would take months and cost thousands of lives. The flamethrower wasn't new to warfare. Ancient armies used burning oil. Byzantine forces deployed Greek fire from siphons. But portable, man-carried flame weapons designed for individual infantry use emerged during World War I.
The Germans introduced the Flammenwerfer in 1915, a bulky, dangerous device that terrified Allied troops in the trenches of Verdun and the Somme. The psychological impact was immediate and undeniable. Soldiers who could withstand machine gun fire and artillery barrages often broke entirely when faced with liquid fire. But the early models were cumbersome, short-ranged, and prone to catastrophic failure. Operators became priority targets. Fuel tanks exploded. The weapons were used sparingly. The United States experimented with flamethrowers during World War I, but saw limited success. The models were heavy, unreliable, and the war ended before doctrine could evolve. Through the 1920s and 30s, the weapon languished in obscurity. The Marine Corps, however, began reconsidering the concept in the late 1930s as tensions with Japan escalated. Amphibious warfare doctrine emphasized the need to neutralize fortified positions quickly. Engineers at the Chemical Warfare Service developed the M1 flamethrower, a significant improvement on World War I designs. It used compressed nitrogen to propel fuel, offered better range, and weighed less. But it still had problems. The ignition system was unreliable. The tanks were fragile. Early combat tests in the Aleutians and Pacific showed promise, but also revealed fatal flaws.
By 1943, the M1 had been replaced by the M2, a flamethrower that would define the Pacific War. The M2 carried 4 gallons of thickened fuel in 2 cylindrical tanks worn like a backpack. The fuel was napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture developed by Harvard chemists that stuck to surfaces and burned longer and hotter than liquid gasoline. The weapon's wand could project a stream of fire up to 40 yards, though effective range was closer to 20 to 30 yards. The ignition system used a small cartridge that sparked the fuel as it left the nozzle. A pressurized nitrogen tank gave the operator roughly 10 seconds of firing time before needing a reload. The weapon weighed 70 pounds fully loaded. Operating it required physical strength, mental discipline, and nerves that could handle walking into enemy fire while carrying what amounted to a bomb on your back. The training was rigorous and unforgiving. Marines learned to operate the weapon blindfolded. They practiced clearing bunkers in mock-ups built to replicate Japanese fortifications. They drilled fuel discipline, how to use short bursts instead of long streams, how to conserve precious seconds of firing time, how to ignite without wasting fuel. They studied angles and trajectories. A flamethrower wasn't a rifle. It didn't shoot in a straight line. The stream arced. Wind affected it. Rain could diminish effectiveness. Operators learned to anticipate splashback, the horrifying phenomenon where burning fuel ricocheted off rock or metal and splashed onto friendly troops. They trained with rifle squads, learning to coordinate movement. A flamethrower operator never worked alone. He was part of a team, riflemen to suppress enemy fire, demolition men to seal exits, scouts to identify targets. The psychological preparation was harder to quantify. Instructors could teach mechanics. They couldn't teach men how to live with what came next. Using a flamethrower wasn't like firing a rifle. It was intimate. It was total. When you pulled the trigger, you didn't just kill, you incinerated. You heard screaming. You smelled burning flesh. You saw men turned into shadows on cave walls. Some Marines requested transfer after their first combat deployment. Others became numb. A few developed a grim efficiency that disturbed even their fellow Marines. There were no easy answers.
The weapon was necessary. The caves had to be cleared, but necessity didn't make it easier to sleep at night. By mid-1944, flamethrower doctrine had evolved significantly. Early deployments treated flame weapons as experimental tools, used sporadically, often as a last resort. But as the island-hopping campaign intensified and Japanese defensive tactics became more sophisticated, flamethrowers transitioned from experimental to essential. On Saipan in June 1944, Marine flame teams proved devastatingly effective against cave networks in the island's interior. On Guam and Tinian in July and August, the weapons became standard equipment for assault units. Commanders developed combined arms tactics. Engineers would identify cave positions. Artillery and mortars would pin down Japanese defenders. Infantry would establish a perimeter. Then the flamethrower teams would move in, riflemen providing suppressing fire while the operator advanced to effective range and delivered fire into the cave mouth.
The results were undeniable. Caves that would have required days of grenades, satchel charges, and close-quarters fighting could be neutralized in minutes. Japanese soldiers faced an impossible choice: stay inside and burn, run outside and face rifle fire, surrender and violate the Bushido code that had been drilled into them since basic training. For years, that code had held. Japanese soldiers fought to the death. They launched suicidal banzai charges. They killed themselves rather than face capture. Surrender was unthinkable, a disgrace worse than death. But the flamethrower introduced a variable that Japanese military indoctrination hadn't prepared them for. This wasn't death in battle. This wasn't a bullet or a bayonet. This was prolonged, agonizing immolation. And for the first time in the Pacific War, that prospect was breaking men who had been taught never to break. The man carrying the M2 flamethrower on Peleliu was 22 years old. His name was Corporal Richard Higgins, though after the war he would request that journalists not use it. He had enlisted in 1942, survived Guadalcanal, and volunteered for flame training because it meant extra pay and a perceived sense of control. Better to carry the weapon than stand beside it, he reasoned. His first combat deployment with the M2 was on Guam, where he cleared 3 caves without incident. The Japanese inside were already dead, killed by artillery or starvation. Peleliu was different. Peleliu was alive. The caves pulsed with defenders. Every shadow held a rifle. Every coral outcropping concealed a spider hole. Higgins carried his flamethrower across Bloody Nose Ridge with his fire team. 2 riflemen, 1 bar gunner, 1 sergeant calling targets. The weight crushed his shoulders. 70 pounds didn't sound catastrophic until you carried it uphill in 100-degree heat while people shot at you. The fuel sloshed in the canks with every step. The straps dug into his collarbone. His hands cramped around the wand's grip. But he kept moving because stopping meant dying. The Japanese had learned to identify flamethrower operators by silhouette. Snipers watched for the twin tanks. Machine gunners adjusted fields of fire to catch flame teams in the open. Higgins had watched 2 other operators die in the first week. One shot through the chest before reaching his target, another caught by a grenade that ruptured his fuel tank and turned him into a fireball that his own squad had to shoot to end his suffering. From the Japanese perspective, the flamethrower represented something beyond conventional warfare. Imperial Army training emphasized spiritual fortitude, acceptance of death, and loyalty to the emperor above all else.
Soldiers were taught surrender was not merely defeat, it was betrayal. Death in combat guaranteed honor. Capture guaranteed shame that extended to a soldier's family for generations. This indoctrination was effective. Across 2 years of Pacific fighting, Americans captured fewer than 1 Japanese soldier for every 100 killed. The ratio was staggering. Men fought until ammunition ran out, then charged with bayonets. When bayonets broke, they used rocks. When rocks failed, they detonated grenades against their own chests. But the flamethrower attacked something deeper than the body. It attacked the will. Japanese soldiers in the caves of Peleliu had endured weeks of bombardment. They had survived artillery that shook the earth and air raids that collapsed tunnels. They had watched friends die and accepted their own deaths as inevitable. But they never experienced napalm. The first time a flamethrower ignited inside a cave network, the effect was apocalyptic. The fuel didn't just burn, it consumed oxygen. Men suffocated before the flames reached them. Those deeper in the tunnels felt the heat roll through like a living thing, baking skin, boiling moisture in their lungs. The screaming was immediate and inhuman. Some ran, some froze. A few tried to smother flames with their own bodies. None of it worked. The M2 flamethrower was a marvel of brutal engineering. The weapon consisted of 4 primary components: 2 fuel tanks, a nitrogen pressure tank, an ignition system, and the wand assembly. The fuel tanks were steel cylinders designed to withstand rough handling and small arms fire, though a direct hit from a rifle round could still rupture them. The nitrogen tank sat between the fuel cylinders and provided the pressure needed to expel fuel at high velocity. Operators wore a harness system that distributed weight across shoulders and back, though comfort was relative. The wand assembly featured a pistol grip with a trigger mechanism and a nozzle that could be adjusted for spray pattern, wide dispersal for area coverage, concentrated stream for penetration. The napalm fuel mixture was key to the weapon's effectiveness. Standard gasoline burned quickly and spread unpredictably. Napalm thickened the fuel into a gel that adhered to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The chemical composition, a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids combined with gasoline, created a substance that stuck to concrete, wood, flesh, and bone. Water couldn't extinguish it. Smothering was difficult. It burned until the fuel was consumed, which could take minutes. Inside confined spaces like caves, the effects were magnified exponentially. Oxygen depletion killed as efficiently as flame. Carbon monoxide poisoning incapacitated survivors. The heat alone, even without direct contact, could render men unconscious. Effective range was approximately 20 to 30 yards, though atmospheric conditions affected performance. Humidity extended range slightly. Wind reduced it. The weapon offered roughly 10 seconds of continuous fire before fuel exhaustion, though operators were trained to use short bursts, 2 to 3 seconds per target, to maximize efficiency. A skilled operator could engage multiple targets with a single load. The ignition system used small pyrotechnic cartridges that sparked the fuel stream as it exited the nozzle. Early models suffered ignition failures, but by 1944, the M2 system was reliable enough for consistent combat use. Reloading required 2 men and approximately 5 minutes, an eternity in combat. Flame teams carried spare fuel and nitrogen tanks, but replacing them under fire was often impossible.
Marine Corps doctrine evolved rapidly around the flamethrower's capabilities. By late 1944, Every assault battalion included dedicated flame platoons. These weren't ad hoc units. They were trained specialists with support structures designed around the weapon's unique requirements. A typical flame team consisted of the operator, 2 riflemen for close protection, a bar gunner to suppressing fire, a demolitions expert with satchel charges to seal secondary exits after clearance, and a sergeant or corporal coordinating movement. The teams trained together for weeks before deployment, developing the intuitive coordination required to function under fire. The tactical sequence for cave clearance became standardized. Reconnaissance identified the target. Mortar teams or artillery suppressed nearby enemy positions. Infantry established a perimeter and cleared approaches of snipers. The flame team advanced under covering fire. Riflemen would spray the cave entrance with automatic fire to force defenders deeper inside. The operator would close to within 20 yards, close enough for accuracy, far enough to minimize return fire risk. He would fire a sustained burst into the cave mouth, angling the stream to maximize coverage. The napalm would ignite everything inside: equipment, ammunition, flesh. If defenders emerged, riflemen cut them down. If they stayed inside, they burned. After the initial burst, demolitions men would seal secondary exits with charges, trapping any survivors. The entire process, when executed properly, took less than 3 minutes. The medical and psychological aftermath affected both sides in ways neither anticipated. For Marine flamethrower operators, the physical injuries were often catastrophic. Fuel tank ruptures from enemy fire resulted in immolation. Splashback from poorly angled shots caused severe burns to friendly troops. Heat exhaustion was common. The weapon's weight combined with protective gear in tropical heat pushed men to their physiological limits. But the psychological injuries proved more persistent. Post-war studies of flamethrower veterans revealed elevated rates of what would later be termed PTSD. The proximity to suffering, the visceral nature of the weapon, the screams, these elements created trauma distinct from conventional combat. Some veterans never spoke about their service. Others developed substance dependencies. A few took their own lives decades after the war, haunted by memories that wouldn't fade. Japanese survivors faced different but equally profound trauma. Those who surrendered after flamethrower attacks carried dual burdens: the physical injuries from burns and the cultural shame of capitulation. Post-war interviews revealed complex psychological states. Some survivors expressed relief. They had faced an impossible situation and chose life over death. Others struggled with guilt that never resolved. The Bushido Code didn't account for surrender under any circumstances. These men returned to Japan after the war as pariahs. Families disowned them. Employment was difficult. Several survivors admitted in later interviews that they wished they had died in the caves. The flamethrower hadn't just defeated them militarily, it had destroyed their cultural identity. The moral debates within U.S. command structure were more nuanced than post-war narratives often acknowledge. Some officers embraced flamethrowers as humane. They shortened battles, reduced overall casualties, and gave enemy soldiers an opportunity to surrender they wouldn't have had otherwise. Others viewed the weapons with deep discomfort. The suffering inflicted was undeniable. The screams carried across battlefields. Navy chaplains reported increased attendance at religious services among units that employed flamethrowers regularly. A few officers requested transfers rather than continue deploying the weapons. But ultimately, the calculus was simple. The alternative, digging Japanese defenders out of caves with grenades and bayonets, cost more American lives and often resulted in complete annihilation of Japanese garrisons anyway. The flamethrower at least offered a chance at surrender. That it also induced terror was not incidental, it was the point.
October 4th, 1944. The Brogo Pocket, Peleliu. 3 weeks into a battle that should have ended in days. Marine casualties exceeded 6,000. The Japanese still held the central ridges. Colonel Nakagawa's defenders had transformed the Coral Highlands into a fortress that swallowed men and gave nothing back. Every ridge concealed bunkers. Every draw held machine gun nests. The Marines advanced yard by yard, day after day, bleeding for ground that didn't matter except that the enemy held it. Intelligence estimated 3,000 Japanese soldiers remained in the pocket. They had to be destroyed. There was no bypassing them. There was no waiting them out. Starvation and thirst would take months. The island had to be secured. Corporal Higgins and his flame team received orders to assault a cave complex designated Hill 100, a coral outcropping honeycombed with tunnels that had repelled 3 previous assaults. The position commanded the surrounding terrain. Japanese machine gunners could sweep the approaches from multiple angles. Artillery had pounded the hill for 2 days straight. The coral looked like the surface of the moon, cratered, blasted, smoking. But the moment the barrage lifted, Japanese soldiers emerged from underground and resumed firing. Grenades hadn't worked. Satchel charges barely scratched the surface. The call went out for flamethrowers. The team moved out at dawn. Higgins carried his M2 with fresh fuel tanks loaded the night before. His hands shook slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the knowledge of what came next. He had burned men before. On Guam, he'd killed at least a dozen, maybe more. The exact number was impossible to calculate. You fired into darkness and heard screaming, and that was it. You didn't see faces. You didn't count bodies. You pulled the trigger and moved to the next target, and tried not to think about it. But Peleliu was different. The caves here were bigger, deeper, more crowded. The screaming lasted longer. The approach took an hour. The team moved through a landscape stripped of vegetation, blackened by fire and explosives. Coral dust hung in the air. Flies swarmed over bodies that hadn't been recovered. The smell was overwhelming. Decomposition, cordite, burning fuel. Sniper rounds cracked overhead. Mortars landed randomly, throwing shrapnel and rock. The team took cover behind a shattered tree trunk while the bar gunner suppressed a machine gun nest 50 yards upslope. The sergeant identified the target, a cave entrance approximately 6 feet wide, 4 feet high, carved into the base of a coral outcropping. Intelligence suggested it connected to a larger tunnel network that might hold anywhere from 20 to 70 soldiers. The operator waited for the signal. His heart hammered. The tanks on his back suddenly felt impossibly heavy. He could hear movement inside the cave, scraping, voices, the metallic sound of weapons being readied. The Japanese knew he was coming. They always knew. Flamethrower teams weren't subtle. The sergeant gave the signal. The rifleman opened up, pouring rounds into the cave entrance. Higgins stood, felt his legs move, started forward. 20 yards, 15. He raised the wand. 10 yards. A rifle shot snapped past his head. Another punched into the coral beside his boot. He squeezed the trigger.
The flamethrower ignited with a sound like tearing fabric. The stream of napalm arced through the air. 20 feet of liquid fire that punched into the cave mouth and disappeared into darkness. For 1 second, nothing. Then the screaming started. It wasn't one voice, it was a chorus. High-pitched, desperate, inhuman. Men burning alive. Higgins held the trigger for 3 seconds, traversing the stream left to right to cover the entrance. The heat blasted back into his face. He released the trigger, stepped aside, let the rifleman move up. 2 Japanese soldiers stumbled out of the cave, clothes on fire, hands over their faces. The bar gunner cut them down before they took 3 steps. But something was different. More movement at the cave entrance. Not soldiers charging, not suicide attacks. Men emerging with hands raised, unarmed, faces blackened with soot and terror. 1, 2, 5, 8. They kept coming. Japanese soldiers stumbling into daylight with hands over their heads, coughing, weeping, begging in broken English. No more fire, please. The Marines stared. In 3 weeks of fighting on Peleliu, mass surrenders didn't happen. You found bodies, you found wounded who fought until they died, you found empty caves. You didn't find men giving up. The sergeant called for ceasefire. The riflemen held their positions, weapons trained on the surrendering Japanese soldiers, fingers resting on triggers. Nobody trusted it. Surrenders could be tricks, wounded men feigning capitulation before detonating grenades. It had happened before. But these men looked genuinely broken. They collapsed in the coral dust, hands still raised, eyes unfocused. Medics moved forward cautiously. 15 Japanese soldiers total, some with minor burns, most suffering from smoke inhalation and shock. The cave behind them still burned. Black smoke poured from the entrance. Corporal Higgins stood 20 yards away, flamethrower still strapped to his back, staring at what he'd done. Word spread fast. By nightfall, every Marine unit on Peleliu knew about Hill 100. 15 surrenders from a single flamethrower burst. The numbers didn't seem possible. For 3 weeks, Marines had killed hundreds of Japanese defenders and captured perhaps a dozen total. Now, in less than 10 minutes, one weapon had produced more POWs than the entire previous operation. Officers began asking questions. What was different? Was it the weapon itself, the tactical approach, the specific circumstances of that cave? Intelligence officers interviewed the prisoners through translators. The answers were consistent and chilling. The Japanese soldiers described the moment the flamethrower ignited inside the tunnel. The napalm had splashed against the cave walls and ceiling, creating a wave of fire that rolled through the connected chambers. Men in the first room died instantly, incinerated where they stood. Those deeper in the tunnel network felt the heat arrive like a physical force, baking exposed skin, boiling moisture in the air. The screaming was immediate and overwhelming. Some soldiers tried to retreat further into the tunnels. Some froze. A few attempted to fight the flames with jackets and bare hands. Nothing worked. The fire consumed everything. Ammunition began cooking off. Equipment melted. The air became unbreathable. But the worst part, the prisoners explained, was the sound. The men in the front chambers didn't die quietly. They screamed for minutes, long, sustained shrieks that echoed through the stone corridors. The survivors deeper in the complex listened to their comrades burn alive and knew they were next. The heat kept intensifying. Smoke filled the tunnels. Men vomited from carbon monoxide poisoning. Some passed out. Others began removing their uniforms, attempting to cool skin that felt like it was cooking from the inside. The psychological collapse was total. Officers who had spent months indoctrinating their men in the Bushido Code, who had led bonsai charges and organized suicide defenses, began ordering retreat. Sergeants who had executed soldiers for cowardice now pushed men toward the cave entrance. Surrender became preferable to burning. One prisoner, a 24-year-old corporal from Osaka, described the moment the order came to exit the cave. His commanding officer, a lieutenant who personally shot 2 men for suggesting surrender the week before, stood at the tunnel junction with tears streaming down his face and told the survivors they could choose to burn or face the Americans. No more orders, no more threats, just a choice. The corporal chose the Americans. 15 others followed. The lieutenant stayed inside and burned. The incident at Hill 100 was not isolated.
Across the Umer pocket, flamethrower teams began reporting similar results. Caves that would have required days of grinding combat were cleared in hours. Japanese resistance, while still fierce, began showing cracks. Snipers who would normally fight until killed started withdrawing. Mortar positions that would fire until overrun began going silent prematurely. And for the first time in the Pacific War, surrenders became semi-regular. Not common, the vast majority of Japanese soldiers still chose death. But where previously surrender rates were near zero, they now climbed to 2 or 3%. In raw numbers, that meant hundreds of lives, American and Japanese, saved by a weapon designed to inflict the most horrible death imaginable. U.S. Marine Corps Command took notice. Reports from Peleliu were distributed to units preparing for future operations. Flamethrower tactics were refined. Procurement of M2 units increased. Training intensified. By November 1944, flamethrower doctrine was being rewritten to emphasize psychological impact alongside tactical effectiveness. Officers were instructed to announce flamethrower presence before assaults, give the enemy a chance to surrender before the fire came. Leaflets were prepared in Japanese explaining what napalm was and what it would do. The message was clear: face the flame and die horribly, or surrender and live. The Japanese High Command also took notice. Reports from Peleliu reached Tokyo by late October. Staff officers read accounts of mass surrenders with alarm and rage. Commanders began issuing increasingly harsh orders. Surrender was forbidden under all circumstances. Officers were authorized to execute any soldier who suggested capitulation. Propaganda emphasized that American flamethrowers were proof of Western barbarism, that a clean death by bullet was preferable to the dishonor of surrender. But the propaganda rang hollow to men who had survived napalm attacks. They knew what the weapon could do. They knew the screaming didn't stop. And faced with that choice, more and more soldiers were deciding that perhaps dishonor was preferable to immolation. By the time Peleliu was declared secure on November 27, 1944, the island had consumed nearly 10 months and 10,000 American casualties. The Japanese garrison was annihilated. Fewer than 200 of the original 10,000 defenders were captured. The rest died in the caves and ridges of the Umer pocket. But the casualty ratios told a story that military analysts found significant. In battles where flamethrowers were employed extensively, Marine casualties were approximately 30% lower than in similar assaults without flame support. The weapon didn't make the fighting easy. Nothing about Peleliu was easy, but it made the fighting faster. Caves that might have taken days were cleared in hours. Bunkers that would have required multiple assaults fell to coordinated flame attacks. And most importantly, it created psychological pressure that conventional weapons couldn't match. The statistical evidence was undeniable. Marine Corps after-action reports documented 202 confirmed surrenders directly attributed to flamethrower attacks during the Peleliu campaign. This compared to 47 total surrenders in the previous 3 months of Pacific operations combined. The weapon was breaking the enemy's will in ways that artillery, airstrikes, and small arms fire could not. Japanese soldiers could endure bombardment. They could face rifles and bayonets, but the flamethrower introduced a variable that human psychology struggled to process. The prolonged agony, the inescapable nature of the fire, the screams of comrades dying in the most horrible way imaginable, these elements combined to create a terror that overrode years of indoctrination. Japanese military leadership struggled to respond. Field commanders on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the next major battles on the calendar, received orders to construct deeper bunkers with multiple escape routes to minimize flamethrower effectiveness. Engineers designed ventilation systems to dissipate heat and smoke. Tunnels were dug with right-angle turns to prevent napalm from reaching deep chambers. Soldiers were issued wet cloths to breathe through in case of flame attacks. Officers rehearsed speeches about honor and duty, preparing to counter the fear they knew would come when the Americans arrived with their fire. But no amount of preparation could fully counter the psychological impact. When the Marines landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1944, they brought flamethrowers by the hundreds, tank-mounted versions, portable M2 units, specialized flame teams trained specifically for cave warfare. The Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage, inflicting horrific casualties on the American forces, but they also surrendered at unprecedented numbers. Over 200 prisoners were taken in the first week alone, a staggering figure for a battle where Japanese doctrine demanded death before dishonor. The flamethrower was cited in intelligence reports as the primary factor driving these surrenders. Soldiers described watching flame teams approach and making split-second decisions to run rather than burn. Officers admitted that maintaining discipline became nearly impossible once the first napalm burst ignited inside a defensive position. The psychological impact extended beyond the immediate battlefield. Japanese propaganda began acknowledging the flamethrower explicitly, something imperial media had avoided for most of the war. Radio broadcasts warned civilians on the home islands about the American fire weapon and urged preparation for invasion. Newspapers published graphic accounts of flamethrower attacks, framing them as evidence of Western cruelty. But the propaganda backfired. Rather than stealing resolve, it spread terror. Civilians began constructing fireproof shelters. Families discussed suicide pacts to avoid capture. The weapon that was meant to break military resistance was now fracturing civilian morale as well.
For the American flamethrower operators, the aftermath was complex and often dark. The Marine Corps recognized their contributions with commendations and medals. Several operators received silver stars for actions on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But the recognition came with a price. These men carried knowledge that set them apart from other veterans. They had inflicted suffering that most people couldn't comprehend. Post-war, many struggled with reintegration. Corporal Richard Higgins returned to Ohio in 1946, worked factory jobs, married, had children. He never told his family what he'd done during the war. When asked, he said he was an infantryman. When pressed, he changed the subject. In a 1982 interview with a military historian conducted on condition of anonymity, Higgins described recurring nightmares, flames, screaming, the smell of burning flesh. "I did what I had to do," he said, "but I'll never say it was right." Medical studies conducted in the 1950s and 60s examined combat stress in World War II veterans. Flamethrower operators showed elevated rates of what researchers termed combat exhaustion and traumatic neurosis, terms that predated modern PTSD diagnoses but described similar symptoms. Insomnia, hypervigilance, substance abuse, difficulty maintaining relationships. Some veterans developed physical ailments with psychological origins, chronic pain, tremors, skin conditions. A few were institutionalized. The VA system, still developing protocols for mental health treatment, struggled to address their specific trauma. The weapons won battles, but they had damaged the men who carried them in ways that took decades to understand. Japanese survivors faced different challenges. Those who surrendered and survived the war returned to a Japan that had been taught surrender was unforgivable. Many used false names. Some emigrated to South America or Southeast Asia to escape stigma.
A handful published memoirs in the 1960s and 70s describing their experiences and attempting to contextualize their decisions. These accounts revealed the impossibility of their situations. One survivor, interviewed in 1978, described watching 12 men burn alive in a cave on Okinawa before running into American hands. "I was 20 years old," he said. "I wanted to live. Judge me if you want. I wanted to live." The weapon itself evolved. The M2 flamethrower was used extensively in Korea and Vietnam, though with diminishing psychological impact as enemy forces developed countermeasures and adjusted tactics. The pure terror that the weapon induced in 1944 and 1945 was never quite replicated. By the 1970s, public opinion on flamethrowers shifted. Images of Vietnamese civilians fleeing napalm strikes generated international condemnation. The weapon became a symbol of indiscriminate violence. The U.S. military began phasing out man-portable flamethrowers in the late 1970s, replacing them with thermobaric weapons and improved explosive systems. The M2 was officially retired from active service in 1978. But the legacy persisted. Military historians continued to debate the weapon's role in shortening the Pacific War. Some argue the flamethrower saved thousands of lives, both American and Japanese, by accelerating Japan's collapse and making invasion of the home islands unnecessary. Others contend that the suffering inflicted was disproportionate and that alternative tactics could have achieved similar results with less horror. The truth likely lies somewhere between. The flamethrower was effective. It was also terrible. Both things can be true simultaneously. Wars are fought with weapons, but they are won or lost in the human mind. The M2 flamethrower understood this in ways that artillery and bombs did not. It attacked not just the body, but the will. It created a choice where Japanese military doctrine insisted no choice existed. Die horribly or surrender and live. For 3 years, the vast majority of Japanese soldiers had chosen death. But when faced with fire that consumed everything, air, flesh, hope, some men discovered that the will to survive was stronger than the code that demanded sacrifice. The young Marine from Ohio who stood at the mouth of that cave on Peleliu never wanted to be remembered for what he did. He wanted to forget. But history doesn't allow forgetting. The weapon he carried changed the calculus of the Pacific War in ways that strategists are still analyzing 80 years later. It forced an enemy that refused to surrender to make impossible choices. It demonstrated that even the most deeply held cultural convictions can fracture under sufficient pressure. And it revealed something uncomfortable about warfare itself, that sometimes the most effective weapons are the ones that make death so terrible that even the bravest men choose survival instead. The flamethrower didn't win the war alone. No single weapon ever does. But in the caves of Peleliu, the tunnels of Iwo Jima, and the ridges of Okinawa, it broke something inside men who had been taught never to break. It offered surrender as a viable alternative to annihilation, and thousands of men, American and Japanese, lived because of it. The screaming still echoes in the memory of those who were there. The nightmares never fully stop. But the war ended, the killing stopped, and in the calculus of total war, perhaps that is the only measure that truly matters. The caves are quiet now. The flames have long since extinguished, but the lesson remains. Technology can change the nature of warfare, But it is the human response to that technology, the fear, the courage, the breaking point, that determines outcomes. The flamethrower revealed where that breaking point lay, and in doing so, it changed the war.